The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. As the nation reflected on 9/11, Jim Zogby says the right wing, aided by the media, unjustly stigmatized fellow Arab Americans. Political scientist Nathan Kalmoe says engaging in partisanship is easier for most Americans than thinking about issues. And editor Bob Cusack of The Hill newspaper talks with Bill Press about Hillary Clinton's potentially divisive new book. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Anti-Arab and Muslim discrimination was fanned by the right wing after 9/11 and aided by the mainstream media, says Jim Zogby. As a result, the views of these groups are now determined by which party you belong to. And we say hello to James Zogby, who co-founded the Arab American Institute in 1985, continues to serve as its president. He is a member of the Executive Committee of the Democratic National Committee and was twice appointed by President Obama to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom in 2013. Jim Zogby, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Well, thank you.
It's our pleasure to have you with us. In addition to running the Arab American Institute, you have a polling firm which recently asked a national sample about their views on Arab Americans, Arabs, Muslims, and Muslim Americans. What did you find, especially regarding how Democrats and Republicans think?
Well, we've been doing this particular poll now for about 20 years. And we have found over the years that a partisan split emerged, which grew in significance as the years went on, but increasingly has now become a demographic split more than a partisan split. In fact, at the end of the day, Republican and Democratic views are almost mirror images of one another. They'll be in the 60% positive among Democrats and 60% negative among Republicans. More extreme are the Trump supporters, whose views will then go to the 80% range negative. And so they are a kind of an interesting subgroup of Republicans. They're even more extreme than the Republican Party itself. The demographics are older, whiter, less educated, and born again. And I'm not saying this as some would accuse me of disparaging those groups of people, but that's the constituency that has gravitated toward those ideas or has been actually able to be moved by those ideas, coming from a very deliberate campaign on the part of Republicans to make Arabs and Muslims into scapegoats, and that the impact has been quite pronounced. So yeah, the two groups, Democrats and Republicans, are completely opposite on this issue. It's really quite striking.
Mm-hmm. Now, since 2010, there has never been more than a 43% favorability rating toward these groups. Why do you think Arab Americans are seen less favorably than many other ethnic or national groups?
Well, one can't, look, 9/11 happened. There's no question about that. The question is, did Arab Americans, were they responsible for it? And the answer is no. Were there groups that tried to exploit that? And the answer is yes. And so when, after 9/11, people had questions, it was who did the media turn to provide answers? And the people they turned to were folks who had a very definite anti-Arab and Islamophobic bias. they became the terrorism experts. A cottage industry of terrorism experts was developed. They were funded by the right. They were used not only in media, but they did training programs for law enforcement, training programs at the Pentagon. Well, George Bush is going around saying they're not the enemy, we have to understand them, etc. His minions, working at the Justice Department and working at the Defense Department and then Homeland Security, were doing exactly the opposite. When the Associated Press and CNN were able to get their hands on the training manuals that were being used for law enforcement and for the Pentagon, we were horrified to see the stuff that was in them, the slanders, the slurs, the sheer bigotry about Arabs and Muslims, and yet that's what was being done. And when you looked at people like Daniel Pipes and Steve Emerson and folks of that sort who were being used by media as terrorism experts, or Jim Woolsey, the former CIA director, who's a part and parcel of that same network, it's really horrifying to think that these were the people that we were turning to for information. And yet, that's what happened. And so, as the years went on, right after 9/11, the numbers didn't switch so dramatically. It took a year, and a year of a steady stream of hostile propaganda that actually took a toll. And then, if you combine it with the fact that there had always been a media culture that had used negative stereotypes, there had always been a political culture largely born of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the biases that were set into that as a result of the propaganda campaigns waged by the pro-Israel side. You put all that together, and you end up with an American people who both didn't know much about the Middle East, but what they did know through the popular culture, media culture, and then political culture was negative. You end up with some very hostile attitudes that were difficult to overcome. I did a book called Arab Voices: What They're Saying to Us and Why It Matters, about the myths that Americans have, why they have those myths, and what the reality is. And it makes the case, I think, quite clearly that we have an American society that just doesn't have direct information, doesn't really, if you look at what we learn in school about the Middle East, it's almost nothing at all. And then you have a media culture and popular culture that actually create these negative images. That's what you get.
We have fomented ignorance, it sounds like. I mean, that in a nutshell, that's what I'm perceiving you saying right now.
It's quite striking, and it's obviously disturbing. I mean, I started a group with a former senator back in 1980 called the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee to deal with these negative stereotypes. We made a little progress. The group still exists, but you know, it's been an uphill battle, and the impact that it's had on the community has been very pronounced. I mean, excluded from politics for many years. It wasn't until Jesse Jackson that we actually were welcomed into a presidential campaign, the first one. Bill Clinton came and spoke to our event in 1998 and was startled when we told him, "You're the first president to ever come and speak with us." And wow. This has been one of the burdens we've had to bear. We've made some progress to be sure, but you know, even when the president appointed me to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, there were groups complaining, "You got an Arab. Why is there an Arab? Why is there somebody who, although I'm Christian, I'm viewed as somebody who sort of supports radical Islam," which is kind of a weird thing for someone to accuse a Christian of. But you know, there are folks who hate us, and we've had to deal with that, and we've had to try to work to overcome it.
We're speaking with James Zogby, co-founder and president of the American Arab Institute, member of the executive committee, the Democratic National Committee. You found a large partisan split on whether there is an increase in anti-Arab and Muslim discrimination. What's the extent of that divide, and how does it differ among age groups?
Well, I guess I mentioned that there was a partisan split that was actually a demographic split, and I described to some extent the Republican side of it. On the Democratic side, what you get are that young people and people of color have a very different view, and that is what forms the more positive component, driving the positives up on the Democratic side. And if you ask people, do you know anyone who's Arab or Muslim? Again, young people, people of color do. The older, white, born again don't, which also accounts for some of the reason why there's a split there. So yeah, there is a very pronounced age difference.
What do you make of the statistic that over half of Americans do not know an Arab or a Muslim, or perhaps they do but don't realize it?
I think it's a little of both. Arab Americans are a small community. We're about 3.5 million. There's a lot of questions about how many Muslims there are, but I think that about 4 or so is right. People will know about them but not know them. People may see them in a distance and not engage with them. Or people just don't know that the person they're dealing with is a Muslim or is an Arab American. I mean, so many Arab Americans don't wear their ethnicity on their sleeve. And while we have the stereotype of the Muslim woman who wears a hijab, many Muslim women don't wear hijab. So it's not like people walk around with identifiers. I can't imagine that people who go to any hospital emergency room or any hospital for treatment have not run into an Arab doctor or a Muslim doctor. And so, yeah, but I think that the issue here is that we're small communities, but we are well situated throughout the country, but people just don't know. And look, to some extent, if there were not these political stereotypes, these negative stereotypes that impact us in other ways, it's almost not a bad idea that people don't know. I mean, it would not be a bad idea because, obviously the point to America is that we don't want everybody walking around saying, I'm Italian, I'm Irish, I'm Polish, I'm Lebanese, or whatever. You really want to have a society where people accept you based on what you do, how effective you are, how good you are, not by your ethnicity or the color of your skin. The problem is that we need folks to know who we are so that they will, in fact, judge us by our character and our quality rather than by our ethnicities. Because they'll say, some people will say to me, you're a good one. Well, I'm not. I'm actually just an average one. I'm not sure about them, but I know I can trust you. Well, if you can trust me, then you can trust them, quote unquote. And so we're dealing with these issues of stereotypes that we have to break through, and so people need to know us, and that's one of the challenges that faces us is putting ourselves out there so that people will know us, so that ultimately it won't matter.
I'm just left shaking my head as I'm listening to you talk about these, with them and you're a good one and that kind of thing. It's mind-boggling to me. What did your survey find regarding support for at least a pathway to legal status for undocumented immigrants?
There is support for this. There is not a sense people have that we ought to. I mean, the Jeff Sessions view is not one widely accepted. Let me put it that way. Even and in particular, when you come to talking about dreamers or these kids who were brought here when they were kids and had no say in the matter, we use the example all the time of when a policeman stops a parent driving a car for speeding or going through a stop sign, kids are sitting in the back seat. You don't give the kids a ticket. They're not responsible for what their parents did. And so in the same way, when you're talking about these kids who came here average age 6, had been in the country for 20 years, don't speak the language of the country they came from, and have no friends or any way of associating themselves as part of that country, whatever it is, people understand that when it's explained to them, and they have an instinctive sense that kids shouldn't be made to pay the price. So, the Republicans are on the wrong side of history on this issue, and they're the wrong side of public opinion. By numbers almost 3-4 to 1, people say, leave these kids alone. And we have a winning case to make, but we just have to be able to get it across. One thing I've noticed, this is a side issue. People don't take the data on DACA as seriously as I think they should. I did some tweets last night about this, just to kind of throw it into the mix. If you look at the numbers on DACA, yes, Mexican are the largest group of DACA recipients or DACA registrants, those who applied for deferred action. But there's over 10,000 Europeans overall who've applied. Largest group of them are from Poland. There's a large group from the UK. There's even a large group not from Europe, but from Canada and Australia. There's 160 countries where these DACA registrants all come from, and yet we sort of dismiss it as, well, it's a Latino issue. It's not. It's an issue that affects every single community, and everyone's got a stake in it.
You asked Americans in your survey about Trump's so-called Muslim ban. What did you find?
I think people had a sense that it wasn't appropriate. That it was big. Again, there was a racial divide, a racial divide, an age divide, a party divide. As I say, the partisan divide is actually a demographic divide on race and on age, etc. And I would add, sadly, on religion. Those who call themselves born again are off the charts in the negative direction, while those who are not consider themselves born again have a very different set of views. So yeah, I mean, there was not a sense that there was one poll that was done by Morning Consult where they framed the issue as the court had framed the issue when it did the stay, and it was trumpeted by the White House as the court upholds their view. It really didn't uphold their view. It defined what would constitute a legitimate series of questions to be asked before admission, but that's not what the executive order by the president did. It was an outrageous effort to ban everyone from these countries, clearly targeting most as Muslims, but as we're now seeing, also affecting Syrian Christians, Iraqi Christians, and the notion that we would prioritize religion over allowing Christians to come and Muslims not to come is bigoted. Bigotry in its worst form, and people get that, and so overall, the notion that you would ban people did not get support.
Well, we've got that going for us, and we can hopefully build on that as well. James Zogby, co-founder and president of the Arab American Institute, joining us today. Also, member of the executive committee of the Democratic National Committee. Jim, thank you so much for your time on americasdemocrats.org. We do look forward to having you back again soon.
I'll do it. Thank you.
Thank you you're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Political scientist Nathan Kalmoe has studied how partisanship has moved away from political ideals and become more of a team sport. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Donald Trump loves it when crowds at his raucous right-wing rallies stand and chant in red-faced fury, "Build that wall! Build that wall!" So he keeps fanning their fire by repeatedly promising to wall off Mexico with a multi-billion-dollar, quote, "big, beautiful barrier on the border." "We must have the wall," he tweeted in late August, promising again that, quote, "Mexico will pay for it." The problem with his bombastic promises, however, is that they turn out to be duds. Even Trump knows that building that wall is nothing but PR Trumpery. In a phone call to President Peña Nieto, he admitted that Mexico actually was not going to pay a single peso for the offensive border partition, but he begged his cross-border counterpart to stop saying so publicly, for Mexico's adamant refusal to pay was exposing Trump, the deal-maker, as a weakling. Still, he loudly threatened again on August 21st to close down our government if Congress doesn't pony up billions to fund his pet project. But just 4 days later, reality intervened when a mass migration poured across the U.S. border. Not a migration of Mexicans, but of floodwaters from the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Harvey's biblical level of destruction not only swamped cities and communities all along the Texas-Louisiana coastline, but it has also swamped Congress with a tsunami of demands from GOP state officials for as much as $180 billion in federal relief, not counting Hurricane Irma. This is Jim Hightower saying, ironically, Trump and his gang of anti-big government congressional zealots were about to cut nearly $1 billion from the federal disaster aid budget when Harvey hit the coast. Now, they're scrambling to add multiple billions of dollars to that budget just to rebuild what Harvey destroyed. Where to get the money? Start by zeroing out every dime that would be frittered away on Donald's folly.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Surprising findings by political scientist Nathan Kalmoe. Only 20% of Americans are engaged enough in politics to identify as either liberal or conservative. And we say hello to Nathan Kalmoe, Assistant Professor of Political Communication and Political Science at Louisiana State University, also the co-author with Donald Kinder of the new book, Neither Liberal Nor Conservative, Ideological Innocence in the American Public. Nathan Kalmoe, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Nice to have you with us as well. Your thesis is that most people are, as the book title says, neither liberal nor conservative. About how much of the electorate does pay attention to ideology and describe themselves as liberal or conservative?
Well, despite the fact that we hear so much about liberals and conservatives, and we often make this assumption, there's this conventional wisdom that if leaders are divided by ideology, then the public must be very divided by ideology as well. And we find that just isn't the case. at best, the public only weakly reflects some of the differences ideologically and in terms of issues of the general of the leadership class. In terms of the actual percentages, you might be surprised to learn that about 45% of the public these days actually either calls themselves moderate, or they say, I haven't even thought much about whether I'm a liberal or a moderate or a conservative. So they avoid the label entirely. And that's in contrast to partisanship, where only about 10 or 15% of people, when you push them, say, you know what, I'm not really aligned with either of the parties. So that's a big distinction between partisanship and ideology in terms of how people describe themselves. It's also the case that if you look at the amount of attention that people are paying and the people that might start to look like they have more ideological views than the rest of the public, we're only talking about the very most knowledgeable segment of the population, maybe 20% or so, who have that level of engagement to be following politics closely enough and to be making sense of it in ways that sort of cohere into what would resemble liberal or conservative ways of thinking.
Now, this inclination of voters to not identify with an ideology they can't even explain is not a new phenomenon, right? I mean, this has been around for several years.
That's right. We're building on research that was conducted in the 1950s and early 1960s when survey research was just getting off the ground. We're covering the span from that time all the way up to the present in our survey evidence that we're looking at. This isn't a new phenomenon. The work that we're building on by Philip Converse found that most people didn't use principled or ideological language naturally when you ask them to talk about politics. Large numbers of people didn't even understand what those terms meant. When you looked at individual issue positions, they didn't cohere into liberal or conservative categories consistently for most people. And even when you look at people's attitudes across 2 or 4 years, the finding was high levels of instability. So in other words, you might have a liberal position on this issue today, and in 2 years or 4 years, you have a conservative position. So people were bouncing around so much that Converse wondered whether they're actually changing essentially at random. There didn't seem to be much stability to people's issue views, in contrast to the stability of their partisanship. Converse even speculated that although our survey evidence comes from the 1940s on, basically, that this is a general phenomenon for the public, that most people in the public just don't pay enough attention or care enough about politics to really organize their views into ideological structures and ways of interpreting the world. And the fact that we don't see much change between the 1950s and 60s and the present is really remarkable, given the fact that the public is much more educated than it was back then in terms of college education. We have a completely different media environment, including the return of partisan media. You have the internet and the information revolution, where there's more information at our fingertips. That's a huge change, and certainly shifts in party politics in terms of the coalitions behind Republicans and Democrats, and certainly the enfranchisement of African Americans based on the National Democrats in the 1960s. So all of those things are big shifts from that time, and yet we don't really see any increase in ideological identification or the structure of people's views.
What are your thoughts on the view that, that people who call themselves moderates or independents are not, as you say, innocent, but are really apathetic and ignorant of issues to begin with?
Right. So we have an ideal of an independent or a moderate citizen who's really supposed to be the referee between ideologues or between partisans, to really be the deciding factor, to evaluate the evidence, to evaluate the arguments, and rationally make a decision about which side, which idea is going to be the best for the country moving forward. But we find, and consistent with previous research, we find that people who call themselves moderates or say that they haven't thought much about ideology, and likewise people who call themselves independents and they don't really lean towards one side or the other, on average those people tend to be less engaged in politics. They tend to be less knowledgeable, and so in many ways they don't resemble that sort of citizen ideal. They're even less likely to participate in voting at all. And so, although there are some people that do resemble that sort of ideal citizen, most people in those categories are not particularly engaged in politics, and we examine on several different metrics whether moderates might be sort of people who call themselves moderates, whether they're sort of substantively moderate in a sort of a serious way, or if that's just a category that people use as a default instead of saying that they haven't really thought about it. And we find it's more the latter, that people who are calling themselves moderates or independents really are pretty apathetic and not particularly knowledgeable about politics.
We're speaking with Nathan Kalmoe, Assistant Professor of Political Communication and Political Science at Louisiana State University and co-author of the new book, Neither Liberal Nor Conservative, Ideological Innocence in the American Public. Nathan, is Trump more dangerous not because of the right-wing policies he espouses, but because he has no ideology, might shift gears, and might bring followers along for the ride merely on his charisma?
It's definitely the case that the consistent findings in our field on the influence of leaders and just the dynamics of the public opinion is that the most prominent leaders on each side, the most prominent Democrats and the most prominent Republicans, are the ones who really shape the issue attitudes of the general public, to the extent that the public has a hold on issue attitudes. So President Trump, as the most visible Republican, is going to have a disproportionate weight on the views of the general public. And part of that is because other Republican leaders kind of gamely go along, even when it's in contrast to traditional Republican positions on policy. But part of that, too, is that people just see the president much more than they see any other leaders. And so Republicans who are only paying, in the public, who are only paying a little bit of attention to politics are going to hear what the president says, and they're not necessarily going to hear what congressional Republicans are saying on these issues if they happen to disagree on those issues. So it's with every president, not just Donald Trump, there is particular influence on the followers within that party. And even though Donald Trump doesn't resemble a traditional Republican, in some ways he does, and in some ways he doesn't, nonetheless, most voters, most people in the public who are Republicans are going to treat him as if he's just another Republican and respond to him in that way. So that is an aspect that gives him particular power to influence the public more so than any other leader at the moment.
Is it fair to conclude that people for generations have shunned ideological labels, but now are adopting partisan labels, Republican or Democrat, simply because it's easier than thinking?
It's certainly true that party is easier to understand than ideology. You've got candidates who run on the basis of their partisanship. You've got a process that filters the ballot in ways that you, in most places, have one Democrat running against one Republican, and that really makes the choice a lot easier for people in the public. Their parents were a particular party that is often passed on through socialization to the next generation, and they just tend to think of themselves as belonging to one party or the other, and that's really knowing that that's who they are politically. They just apply that label wherever they see it, and so a Democrat is quite likely to vote for Democratic candidates just because they see that they're a Democrat, and the same is true for Republicans. It's only among the most engaged, most knowledgeable citizens that you might start to see deviations if there's a conflict between policies and the party label. So in that case, really you've got people who are just making choices based on their partisanship and not on deeper substantive kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, what you and your co-author have found, to me, is pretty depressing, frankly. Is our political system dying?
I wouldn't go that far. Because we found that this is a similar diagnosis, I guess you could say, of the general public, not just now, but across time, as far back as we can see with this kind of evidence. It suggests that we managed to, if you don't like this state of affairs, we managed to muddle through as a public for the last several decades in this state. If you think that this is how things have been even further back, we've muddled through for better or worse at various times in our nation's history. And so in that sense, at least in terms of public opinion, there is not a sense, I think, from our research that the political system is dying. I think speaking more broadly about political science, there's certainly important warning signs about ways that politics at the leadership level has been changing directions, certainly concerns about press freedom, certainly concerns about adherence to the Constitution, concerns about nepotism and the role of family in politics and corruption and other kinds of negatives that sometimes arise, and how that can interact with partisanship. And when party leaders as well as the public are just rooting for their team, it allows them to try to excuse the misbehavior by their side and to try to overblow the alleged misbehavior on the other side. And in some ways, the current state of affairs in politics is more concerning than we've seen in a long time. I think that has less to do with the public than it does to do with the leadership level. On the other hand, the way that we understand how the public thinks about politics means that the public is going to be participating in sort of amplifying some of these concerns that we see at the leadership level, because people in general don't pay close attention to politics and they tend to just support their side, to support their party.
Pay attention, people. Please pay attention. Nathan Kalmoe, Assistant Professor of Political Communication and Political Science at Louisiana State University, co-author with Donald Kinder of the new book, Neither Liberal Nor Conservative, Ideological Innocence in the American Public. Nathan, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press and editor Bob Cusack are concerned that Hillary's new book will divide Democrats again.
Speaking of popularity, you may have seen the NBC Wall Street Journal poll. Latest poll shows that Donald Trump, only 36% of Americans feel good about him and the job that he's doing as president. 52% have a negative feeling about Donald Trump. But Donald Trump could turn around and say, I may be only 36%, but Hillary Clinton is only 30%. And this
still
on
beating her by 6. Okay.
This on the eve of her national book tour.
Yes.
Coming out, which a lot of Democrats are a little uneasy about, because it's just going to be rehashing 2016.
Yes, uneasy, I think, is a nice word. We have a story on thehill.com this morning that a lot of Democrats are very frustrated with this, that relitigating it's like relitigating a loss in the Super Bowl. It was a painful loss, as you know, for Democrats, going after Bernie Sanders, going after Joe Biden. Now, our reporter Alexander Bolton asked Bernie Sanders, what do you think of these attacks on you? and Sanders said the right thing. Oh, listen, I want to look forward. I don't want to look back. But some Democrats are rolling their eyes, no doubt.
And we talked yesterday about her comments on Bernie, which I think were just flat-ass wrong. Mm-hmm. I think that primary was the best thing that happened to the Democratic Party, and you can't blame her loss, in my opinion, on Bernie Sanders. I'm not the only one with that opinion. But but how about the Joe Biden stuff has surprised me.
Yeah,
what did she say about Biden? It was...
That Biden had criticized her for not focusing on middle-class families.
Yeah, right.
And then she said, well, that's surprising because he campaigned with me in various parts of the country, and
Yeah.
we did just that. Now, remember, there's a tension between Biden and Clinton, and Biden took a shot at her when he announced he wasn't going to run in the Rose Garden with Obama, and Obama was certainly pushing Joe not to run. So there's a history, and also the Clinton campaign was also frustrated that Biden took so long to decide. They were nervous about Biden getting into the race, and so I think there's some tension there, and now it's out in the open. I just don't see how this helps the Democratic Party.
I was just going to say, yeah, right.
How does it help? I mean, the Democrats, by and large, are united, and this she's going to do interviews for the book. The book is going to do well because it's more controversial than I thought it would be. But how does it advance the goals of the Democratic Party? I don't see that.
It does not. Mm-hmm. And I thought one of the most hopeful things that happened with the Democratic Party is after the race for Democratic National Chair,
mm-hmm.
which to a certain extent was a replay of 2016,
yes.
in that you had Keith Ellison, Bernie,
mm-hmm.
Bro,
yep.
and Tom Perez, who was asked to run by President Obama,
yes.
right, supported by Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
It's kind of a rerun. But once that was over, and Tom Perez won, right away, the first thing he did was
appoint.
My co-chair,
yep.
basically, is
Smart.
Keith Ellison, and we're together now, and we're moving forward. And they have been.
Yes.
They've been campaigning together. Bernie's been campaigning with Tom Perez.
Yep.
And they're looking at state legislative seats and governor's races and congressional races, city council races, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're really kind of, I think, getting down into the grassroots.
Yep.
And moving forward together, and then suddenly you've got this stink bomb, about...
It is, and obviously, once again, a painful loss certainly for Democrats, devastating in many ways because it was so unexpected. But if you look at whether it's Mitt Romney or Al Gore even, after they lost, they took a sabbatical and I think came back as somewhat statesmen in the party, but they did take that break from politics to say, okay, because when you're the nominee, there's a lot of pressure on you to win, and if you don't, you're disappointing your party, and I just think this is something that Democrats are going to grumble about for a while. Now, of course, Hillary Clinton has a base of support, and a lot of her fans want to hear from her. But what role will she play in the 2018, 2020 elections? That's something to watch. But Democrats don't like this infighting.
The other contrast, I think, is Bernie's book and Hillary's book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bernie's book is Our Revolution. Here's what we ought to be talking about. Here are the issues we ought to be talking
yep.
about. Here's how we get back the Senate and the House and the White House on
mm-hmm.
these issues, single payer and all the other issues. Agree or disagree. It was a positive, looking forward book.
Mm-hmm.
And now the contrast with Hillary Clinton, which is a looking back book and
yes.
trying to settle old scores.
Yeah.
Last thing the Democratic Party needs.
Yeah, and Schumer's been a little frustrated, too, with what Hillary Clinton has said. I take responsibility for losing, but then also blaming Comey. And you can make that argument, but Schumer, reading in between lines, he wants to move on. You got to look, as a party, you always have to say, let's learn from the last election, but let's look forward, not back.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jim Zogby, Nathan Kalmoe, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.